The grandfather clock in my father's Oyster Bay library didn't tick. It thudded. A heavy rhythmic drop of brass that felt less like time passing and more like a gavel falling. Outside, the Long Island Sound was a flat, slate gray under the June rain, beating a steady rhythm against the leaded glass windows. Inside, the air was thick with the ghost of my father's Cuban cohibas, and the very real, suffocating scent of Vivian's Chanel No. 5. Then came the sharp metallic clatter. Edward, the family's long-standing estate attorney, had dropped his pen. Not just dropped it. His fingers had simply ceased to grip the $2,000 Mont Blanc. It rolled across the polished mahogany table, leaving a thin black trail of archival ink across the crisp white bond paper of page 42. Edward didn't reach for it. He sat frozen. His chest stopped moving beneath his bespoke Seville Row vest. His eyes, magnified behind gold-rimmed reading glasses, were locked onto a single, italicized paragraph buried at the bottom of the page. The color drained from his jowls so fast it left his skin looking like wet chalk. Edward. Vivian's voice cut through the silence. It was a beautiful voice, silky, modulated, the product of decades spent navigating Manhattan's high society. But right now the polish was wearing thin. She leaned forward, the 3-carat solitaire diamond on her left hand catching the dim library light. What is the delay? Read it. Read the section where she waives her rights. I want it on the record. Edward didn't look up. A single bead of sweat broke from his receding hairline and traced a slow path down his temple. His lips parted but no sound came out. Beside her, my stepbrother Julian shifted impatiently. He adjusted his Wharton alumni ring, his knuckles cracking in the quiet room. Edward, we don't have all day. The private equity guys from Silicon Valley are waiting on the conference line for the clean cap table. Just read the damn sentence so we can execute the assignment. I sat across from them, my hands folded loosely in the lap of my black wool dress. I didn't sweat. I didn't shift. I kept my breathing shallow, rhythmic, exactly like my father had taught me when we used to sit across from corporate raiders in rooms identical to this one. They thought I was drowning in grief. They thought the quiet girl with the public interest law degree from NYU was finally breaking under the weight of her father's death. They were wrong. I wasn't the prey. I was the architect. And Edward had just realized that the document he was holding wasn't a surrender. It was a detonator. To understand how we arrived at this mahogany table, you have to understand the sheer, unadulterated weight of Victoria Holdings LLC. $350 million in commercial real estate, logistics, and maritime shipping lines. My father, Richard Vance, built it from a single tugboat. I spent 5 years of my life, my 20s, sleeping on office couches, tracking supply chain data, and learning the brutal mechanics of corporate law to keep that empire afloat while my father's heart slowly failed him. But Vivian and Julian didn't see the sweat. They only saw the balance sheet. When the funeral dirt was still fresh, they produced the new will. It was a masterpiece of legal malice, drafted by Edward under the cover of darkness while my father lay semi-conscious in a hospice bed. The document was clear. Julian was to inherit 100% of the common shares. That meant voting control. That meant the board seats. That meant the keys to the kingdom. And me? I was handed 100% of the preferred shares of a newly minted family trust fund. It's for your own protection, Clara, Julian had told me the day after the funeral. He had smiled that pristine veneered smile, the one he practiced for the business journals. His tone was dripping with that condescending, upper-class politeness that hurts worse than a physical blow. You've always been so focused on social justice on the charity side of things. The cutthroat reality of faux wall. It's just not your arena. With the preferred shares, you get a fixed 15% annual dividend. You'll be wealthy, comfortable, and completely insulated from the risk. Let the men handle the heavy lifting. It was a financial execution disguised as an act of grace. By stripping me of common shares, they effectively locked me out of the company I helped build. They knew the Silicon Valley firm, Blackstone Partners, was offering $400 million to buy Victoria Holdings. But Blackstone had a strict covenant. They would not buy a company with an untidy capital structure. They demanded a clean slate, meaning my preferred shares had to be wiped off the books before the acquisition could close on Monday morning. So Julian and Vivian tightened the noose. First, They used their new board control to freeze the escrow account my father had set up for my grandmother's specialized medical care in Switzerland, claiming the funds were unverified corporate distributions. Then, Edward hit me with a formal notice of malicious intent, threatening to sue me for perjury and violation of non-disclosure agreements because I had logged into my father's personal server the night he passed. They threatened to ruin my reputation, bar me from the New York legal registry, and leave my grandmother to die in an underfunded state facility if I didn't sign over my shares for zero consideration. They wanted to see me beg. They wanted to see the illegitimate daughter of Richard Vance's first wife crawl out of their sight, broken and penniless. Pop culture is obsessed with revenge stories where the protagonist snaps, wielding anger like a blunt instrument. But real vengeance, the kind that lasts, the kind that systematically erases your enemies from existence, requires absolute icy stillness. It requires you to look at the greedy heirs who are trying to destroy you, and instead of fighting them, you build them a gilded highway straight to their own hell. You let their own avarice do the digging. Clara, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing into cold slits as she stared at my silence. If you are having second thoughts about the signature, remember the Swiss clinic requires the next wire transfer by 5 p.m. today. Julian has the authorization code ready. Don't let your stubbornness shorten your grandmother's remaining days. I looked at her. I let a microscopic tremor touch my lower lip. I let them see exactly what they wanted to see. A terrified, beaten girl. I'm not having second thoughts, Vivian. I whispered, my voice deliberately small, hollowed out by fake defeat. I want to make sure Edward reads the indemnification clause. I need to know I am completely safe from your lawyers once I walk out of this room. Julian let out a short, mocking laugh. You're safe, Clara. Frankly, once this document is executed, we won't even remember your name. He nodded at Edward. Read it, Edward. Now. Edward finally lifted his head. His glasses had slipped down the bridge of his nose. The sophisticated, untouchable Manhattan lawyer looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the noose tightening around his throat. He looked at Julian, then at Vivian, his eyes pleading for a way out of the room. I can't, Edward stammered, his voice cracking like dry kindling. What do you mean you can't? Julian snapped, his patience evaporating. He snatched the paper from Edward's trembling hands. It's standard boilerplate language. Give it here. Julian lowered his eyes to page 42. He scanned down to the italicized section, his Wharton-trained eyes moving rapidly across the legal text. And then right before my eyes, Julian's arrogant smile didn't just fade. It vanished entirely, replaced by a raw, visceral look of absolute terror. Julian's chest heaved. A sharp, ragged breath slipped past his clenched teeth. But before the mounting panic in that library could boil over into screams, my mind anchored backward. Back to the freezing rain of 3 weeks ago. Back to the methodical, step-by-step demolition of my life. They didn't just want my shares. They wanted my utter erasure. In the American legal system, if you have enough capital, you don't need to hire a hitman to eliminate someone. You hire a Tier 1 law firm to suffocate them under mountains of white paper. That was Julian's opening gambit. It began exactly 4 days after my father's funeral. I was sitting in the intensive care waiting room at NYU Langone, my wool coat still damp from the outside sleet, when my phone vibrated against my palm. It wasn't a condolence call from the board. It was a formal digital notification from the chief accounting officer at Victoria Holdings LLC. The digital signature at the bottom belonged to my stepbrother. The message was brief, cold, and devastatingly precise. The $5 million medical escrow account my father had established at Banque Privée Edmond de Rothschild in Geneva had been frozen. That account didn't fund luxury properties or offshore yachts. It funded the advanced palliative life support systems for my grandmother Martha at a specialized neurological facility in Montreux. She was 84, withered by advanced vascular dementia, entirely dependent on a $45,000 monthly wire transfer to keep her lungs expanding. My father had designed that escrow to be an ironclad shield, funded by the long-term rental yields of our commercial plazas in Queens. But Julian didn't care about honor or family blood. He cared exclusively about leverage. Edward had filed an ex parte emergency petition in the Sagitt's Court of Nassau County that very morning. The argument was a masterclass in corporate bad faith. Because the Queen's Plazas were technically held under a Tier 3 subsidiary of Victoria Holdings, Edward argued the rental yields belonged to the corporation, not my father's personal estate. Until the entire probate process was resolved, a process they could easily drag out for years, Julian claimed the corporation had a strict fiduciary duty to halt all unauthorized offshore capital distributions. When I called Julian, my hands shaking against the freezing glass window of the hospital corridor, his voice was smooth, untethered by raw malice, yet entirely lethal. "It's just standard corporate governance, Clara," he said, the distant sound of a golf broadcast murmuring in his background. "We can't have company funds flying into Switzerland without proper board oversight. Of course, if you were to sign the full release of your preferred shares, the board would gladly approve an immediate, discretionary medical grant for Martha. It's your choice, really. The corporate machinery moves slowly, but you can speed it up with a single signature." He was holding a pillow over my grandmother's face, using a fountain pen as the lever. Before I could even process the cruelty of the escrow freeze, the second blade fell. It came at 2 o'clock in the morning. A heavy, aggressive knocking on the door of my small one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. I opened it to find a burly process server with a face like weathered gravel. He shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest, muttered "You've been served," and walked down the dim stairwell without looking back. Inside were 40 pages of litigation documents. Victoria Holdings LLC v. Clara Vance. The charges were staggering: corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and a formal threat of criminal referral for perjury. The night my father died, while he was slipping into a hepatic coma at his Park Avenue penthouse, I had used his master keycard to log into his study. I wasn't looking for trade secrets or bank routing numbers. I was looking for his medical power of attorney, desperate to find his specific directives regarding resuscitation. But the automated security logs had registered my access. Julian and Edward twisted that final act of a desperate daughter into a calculated raid on proprietary trade secrets. They filed a sworn affidavit, signed by Edward, claiming I had downloaded confidential valuation models regarding the upcoming Blackstone acquisition. Worse, they dug up a preliminary estate disclosure form I had signed weeks earlier and claimed I had intentionally omitted a minor joint checking account my father had opened for me when I was a teenager. They called it asset concealment. They called it perjury under New York penal law. The strategy was clear. Hit me so hard, threaten my future so completely, that I would abandon my NYU law degree before I even passed the bar. A criminal indictment, even a fabricated one, would destroy my character and fitness review. I would never be allowed to practice law. I would be a convicted felon before my career even started. They didn't just attack me in the dark. They did it under the glittering lights of Manhattan high society. 2 weeks ago, at the annual Met Cloisters Gala, a charity event my father had sponsored for 20 years, I attended to honor his memory. I wore my simplest black dress, sitting near the back of the pavilion. Vivian ensured everyone knew my new status as an outcast. During the cocktail hour, she approached my table, flanked by 2 members of the elite corporate board. Her diamonds gleamed beneath the medieval stone arches. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hiss. She spoke with the practiced, gentle cadence of a mother worried about a wayward child. "Clara, darling," Vivian said, her hand resting lightly on my bare shoulder. Her fingernails, painted a deep oxblood red, dug just deep enough into my skin to leave a dull ache. "We are all so terribly worried about you. This obsession you have with contesting your father's final wishes. It's becoming quite unseemly. People are talking. They say you're trying to extort Julian, just as the company is on the verge of greatness." The board members nodded, their expressions shifting into masks of aristocratic disgust. "Vivian," I said, my voice tight, my throat dry. "You know the will was altered while he was on morphine. You know what he built was meant to be shared." Vivian let out a soft, elegant sigh, shaking her head as if looking at a tragic, delusional creature. "Your father gave you exactly what you deserved, dear. A quiet, unimportant stipend for a quiet, unimportant life. To drag his name through the mud of a public lawsuit. It shows a complete lack of breeding. Julian is trying to save this family's legacy from the Silicon Valley sharks. If you continue this foolish resistance, we will be forced to let the public see the litigation files. The hacking charges. The perjury allegations. The world will see you not as Richard Vance's daughter, but as a vindictive girl trying to sabotage her own family's survival. She patted my shoulder, her touch ice cold. Be sensible, Clara. Sign the papers Julian sent you. Walk away with your dignity intact while you still have a sliver of it left. No one in this city will back a girl who steals from her father's deathbed. That night I walked back to the subway in the pouring rain. My shoes completely soaked through. My spirit pushed to the absolute edge of the abyss. Every single door in Manhattan was slammed shut in my face. My grandmother's Swiss clinic was threatening immediate discharge within days due to the unpaid balance. My legal career was dead before arrival. My pristine name was being systematically dragged through the mud by the very people who had poisoned my father's final months. I had nothing left but an icy, unyielding focus. I would not crawl. I would give them exactly what their hearts desired, and watch them burn inside it. Julian's arrogant smile didn't just fade. It vanished entirely, replaced by a raw, visceral look of absolute terror. He stared at page 42 as if the paper were secreting cyanide. But to understand the sheer trap he had just stepped into, you have to understand the 48 hours that led to this room. You have to understand how a broken girl from Brooklyn transformed herself into an executioner. It began on Tuesday night. I had returned to my apartment on Atlantic Avenue. My coat soaked through with the bitter New York rain. The apartment smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. I didn't turn on the lights. Anger is an expensive luxury when you are outgunned by a multi-million-dollar corporate machine, and I couldn't afford to waste a single calorie on tears. I needed to find my father's real legacy. I walked straight to the vintage bookshelves in my small living room. I pulled down an old, heavy brass marine chronometer, the first piece of equipment my father had bought when he operated a single tugboat in the harbor. I didn't look at the time. I twisted the heavy brass bezel 3 times clockwise, then twice counterclockwise. A soft, mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. A hidden drawer in the mahogany base slid open. Inside lay a single tarnished silver key stamped with the number 814. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I stood inside the vaulted basement of the Chase Manhattan branch on 42nd Street. The air down there was cold, smelling of ozone and old currency. The bank manager didn't talk. He led me past the heavy steel bars to box 814. When the safety deposit box slid out, my hands remained steady. Inside was a single blue expanding folder labeled Project Nemesis. My father was a corporate shark. He didn't die blind. He knew Vivian was tampering with his heart medication, and he knew Julian was gutting the company from the inside. The first document in the folder was a handwritten memorandum from my father, dated 6 months before his hospital admission. It detailed an unrecorded corporate ledger for an offshore entity named Vance Marine Logistics Cayman Limited. Julian had been inflating the parent company's EBITDA to attract the Silicon Valley private equity firm. To make Victoria Holdings look like a pristine investment, Julian had quietly shifted $42 million in unpaid international maritime fuel tariffs and toxic operational liabilities directly into this Cayman shell company. He thought he had buried the bodies where no New York auditor could ever find them. I pulled out my phone. I didn't take standard photos. I opened a high-security, encrypted legal application that directly routed data to a secure cloud server hosted in Reykjavik. I scanned every single page of the Cayman ledger. Once the upload confirmation flashed green, I walked out into the lobby. I approached a heavy-duty crosscut paper shredder I had rented from an office supply store down the block. I fed my father's original papers into the steel teeth, watching them turn into unreadable gray dust. I left no paper trail for Julian's private investigators to follow. But the real weapon wasn't the ledger. It was the unrecorded amendment to the restated trust covenant of the Family Trust Fund, which held my preferred shares. My father had quietly executed this amendment using his residual powers as the sole corporate settler. Section 42B contained a dormant, lethal statutory trigger. Under New York estate and tax law, if a beneficiary executes a non-compensated transfer, a total gift of trust assets to an existing shareholder, while the underlying holding company is under a federal cloud, the entire tax and criminal liability of all subsidiary entities instantly shifts to the recipient. I left the bank and walked 3 blocks through the Midtown crowd to a small convenience store near Grand Central Station. I paid cash for a prepaid Android burner phone. I stepped back onto the wet, noisy sidewalk of Lexington Avenue, pulled my hood over my head, and dialed an unlisted 10-digit number. The phone rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Miller. Christopher Miller was a senior special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Manhattan. He was also an NYU law alumnus who had delivered a guest lecture on international corporate tax fraud during my seminar last spring. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Agent Miller, I have the complete digital forensic footprint for the offshore accounts of Vance Marine Logistics Cayman Limited. I have the bank routing numbers, the hidden ledgers, and the transaction logs showing the deliberate evasion of $42 million in federal maritime tariffs. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the distant clatter of a Manhattan office. Who is this? Miller asked, his tone sharpening instantly. A concerned citizen who is about to execute a corporate transfer, I said, my voice steady, ice cold. The IRS has been trying to pierce Victoria Holdings' corporate veil for 3 years. On Friday morning at 10 o'clock, the primary suspect will voluntarily assume total, personal legal liability for those Cayman accounts. I will upload the decryption keys to your secure tip portal in exactly 5 minutes. Have your team ready at the Rockefeller Center. I hung up. I pulled the battery out of the burner phone, walked to the corner of 45th Street, and dropped the plastic pieces into a deep storm drain. The trap was set. Now I just needed the prey to open his mouth. I walked back to my apartment, sat down at my wooden kitchen table, and stared at my personal cell phone for 3 full minutes. I closed my eyes. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, lowering my heart rate. When I opened my eyes, I forced my face to soften, allowing the appearance of absolute, broken defeat to take over. I needed to play the victim so perfectly that Julian's Ivy League intellect would be completely blinded by his own arrogance. I dialed Julian's private number. Hey, erase the thing about revenge stories. People think they require shouting, confrontation, or dramatic ultimatums. They don't. They require you to let your enemies believe they have completely crushed you. Julian answered on the 3rd ring. Clara, he said, his voice brisk, impatient, the sound of a man who was already counting his Silicon Valley millions. I hope you're calling to tell me you found some common sense. The billing department at the Swiss clinic doesn't keep beds open for charity cases. I forced a small choked sob into the receiver. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted the copper tang of blood, letting the sharp physical pain anchor my performance. Julian, please, I whispered, my voice trembling, sounding exactly like a frightened child. You win. I can't do this anymore. The lawsuits. The threats from Edward. I haven't slept in days. My grandmother. The clinic said they'll move her to a public ward on Friday if the wire doesn't clear. Please don't do this to her. I heard Julian exhale over the line. A slow, predatory sound of total, unadulterated satisfaction. I told you from the beginning, Clara. You're simply not cut out for this arena. You should have trusted family. I'll sign, I whimpered, staring at my own steady, motionless reflection in the dark window pane. I'll sign the uncompensated transfer. I'll give you all the preferred shares for 0 consideration. Just, please promise me you'll authorize the Swiss medical wire the moment my signature is on the paper. Of course, Julian said, his tone dripping with a smooth, trick-thwong generosity. We're family, Clara. Edward will have the final execution documents ready at his Rockefeller Center office this Friday morning at 10. Don't be late. I won't, I said, pausing as if gathering my last shred of dignity. But I have one condition. I want independent auditors from the estate's clearing bank present. I want this completely official so your lawyers can never harass me again. Julian let out a dry, mocking chuckle. Have whoever you want there, Clara. It won't change the text. See you Friday. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The trembling in my hands vanished in an instant. My face settled back into a mask of pure, unyielding marble. The greedy heirs wanted a total surrender. I was about to give them a perfect slaughterhouse. The celebration started at 9 o'clock Thursday night, hours before our scheduled meeting. Julian didn't wait for my signature to dry. Arrogance demands an audience. He booked the private wine vault at the Grill on Park Avenue, a subterranean room lined with vintage Madeira and polished walnut. I know this because the corporate credit card transaction logs still pinged my encrypted tablet. He spent $42,000 on dinner, buying 2 magnums of 1990 Chateau Petrus to impress the Blackstone directors. Vivian sat at the head of that table, draped in emerald silk that matched the ice in her eyes. She was toast-mastering her son's ascension. To them, I was already a ghost, a minor accounting error that had been permanently erased from the ledger. Julian was loud, his voice carrying through the heavy oak door every time a waiter entered. He wasn't just drinking. He was intoxicating himself on the illusion of absolute power. To a clean cap table, Julian announced, raising his baccarat crystal flute toward the Blackstone executives. The crystal caught the low amber light of the room, throwing sharp, fractured reflections across his face. By noon tomorrow, Victoria Holdings will be a streamlined machine. No legacy dead weight. No sentimental baggage. Just pure, unadulterated raw cash flow. The Blackstone executives smiled their expensive, mercenary smiles. They cared only about liquidity. They needed Julian to execute a binding memorandum of understanding that night, a commitment guaranteeing the acquired assets were free of prior encumbrances. Julian didn't hesitate. He pulled out his custom gold Pelican pen and signed the MOU right on the wine-stained tablecloth. He was selling an empire he didn't legally own yet, betting everything on the certainty that I was too weak to fight back. That was his first fatal miscalculation. In corporate acquisitions, the deadliest weapon isn't malice. It's contempt. Julian held such profound contempt for my public interest degree, for my nights spent in the logistics trenches, that he never considered I might be playing a completely different game. He saw my compliance as fear. He saw my tears as the submission of an inferior mind. And then there was their chief architect, Edward. A Tier 1 Manhattan estate lawyer doesn't usually commit malpractice. The partners at White & Case or Skadden are paid too well to be sloppy. But Edward wasn't acting as an independent legal counselor anymore. He was acting as a primary stakeholder. Julian had covertly promised him a flat 1% transaction success bonus upon the final closing of the Blackstone acquisition. On a $400 million deal, that meant a $4 million wire transfer hitting Edward's private offshore account in West Palm Beach. Greed like that acts as a devastating cognitive solvent. It entirely dissolves professional caution. It slowly eats away at the most basic foundational protocols of legal due diligence. On Thursday afternoon, while Julian was selecting his dinner wines, Edward sat in his corner office on the 45th floor of the Rockefeller Center. The desk was piled high with the 500 pages of the closing binders. He had a flight booked to Miami for Friday evening. He was tired, his eyes bloodshot from 70-hour work weeks, his mind already walking the fairways of his Florida golf club. Edward's job was to review the final transfer instrument I was supposed to sign. He spent 4 hours meticulously refining the exculpatory clauses, ensuring that once I signed, I could never sue Julian for emotional distress, fraud, or duress. He made sure the waiver of my preferred shares was airtight, ironclad, and unforgiving. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He never ordered a fresh, certified title and encumbrance search on Vance Marine Logistics Cayman Limited. Why would he? He had drafted the original corporate bylaws himself 3 years ago. He knew the Cayman shell was technically a separate legal entity, wholly owned by Julian's private holding company, designed to keep the maritime fuel liabilities off the New York books. Edward assumed that since the old man, my father, had been confined to a hospital bed or a heavily medicated penthouse for the last 8 months, the corporate structure had remained completely static. He completely ignored the basic rule of equity law. A trust settler retains residual amendment powers until the exact moment of cognitive death. Edward saw the blue, flashing notification on his secure electronic billing portal indicating that a modified trust schedule had been filed with the Nassau County Clerk 6 months ago. But he didn't click the link. He didn't pay the $45 statutory fee to download the PDF of the restated trust covenant. To him it was procedural noise. He looked at the file size, looked at the automated timestamp, and murmured to his senior paralegal, "It's just the old man's funeral directives and burial plots. Don't waste the billable hour on cross-referencing it. We already have Clara's primary liability waiver drafted and ready." That $45 electronic PDF contained the lethal trap of Section 42B. It contained the cross-indemnification trigger that my father and I had drafted over cold coffee in his hospital room, while the monitors beeped out the remaining days of his life. My father had looked at me with his yellowing, jaundiced eyes and said, "Clara, they think I'm an old fool who can be managed by morphine. They don't know that I built this company to be a trap for anyone who tries to hurt you. Let them take the crown. The crown is lined with thorns." Julian and Edward spent the rest of Thursday night laughing, drinking, and finalizing their wire instructions. They called their brokers. They looked at luxury penthouse listings on the Upper East Side. Julian even texted his tailor to order 3 new custom-tailored suits for the Monday morning press conference with Blackstone. They were completely blind to the reality of the American legal apparatus. The corporate veil isn't an unbreachable wall. It's a fabric. And if you pull the right thread, the thread connected to federal tax evasion, the entire structure collapses into a pile of rags. While Julian was pouring the last glass of Petrus, I was sitting in my dark kitchen in Brooklyn, watching a blue progress bar on my laptop screen. The encrypted upload to the IRS secure portal was at 99%. I watched the final pixels snap into place. Upload successful. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. Closed. The laptop went to bed and slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. I knew that when the sun rose on Friday morning, the greedy heirs wouldn't just be signing a contract. They would be walking directly into a federal buzzsaw. The conference room on the 45th floor of the Rockefeller Center didn't feel like a place where lives were ruined. It felt like a temple of cold efficiency. Glass walls stretched from the polished terrazzo floor to the acoustic ceiling, framing a New York skyline that was completely swallowed by low, wet clouds. The air inside was chilled to exactly 68 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive toner and dry-cleaned wool. They were all waiting for me. Julian sat on the left side of the 40-foot glass table, his Bloomberg terminal open on a tablet, his fingers tapping a rapid, impatient rhythm against his Wharton alumni ring. Vivian sat beside him, her black Tom Ford dress immaculate, her posture as rigid as the steel beams supporting the skyscraper. Across from them sat the Blackstone representatives, 3 men in identical charcoal suits, their faces masks of elite Silicon Valley indifference. In the far corner, 2 independent clearing auditors from BNY Mellon sat behind open laptops, their presence required by my explicit, non-negotiable demand for independent verification. And then there was Edward. He sat at the head of the table, flanked by stacks of leather-bound corporate binders, looking like a high priest about to finalize a sacrifice. I walked in at exactly 10 o'clock. I wasn't wearing the black dress of a grieving daughter anymore. I wore a crisp white tailored pantsuit. It was an intentional choice. In a room full of dark suits and darker intentions, white wasn't the color of innocence. It was the color of a surgical blade. "You're late, Clara," Julian said without looking up from his screen. His voice carried that familiar, patronizing edge, the tone of a man who believed he had already won. "The Blackstone guys have a hard stop at 11 for a flight back to San Francisco. Let's not waste any more of their billable hours." "The rain slowed down the subway, Julian," I said, my voice deliberately soft, flat, completely devoid of inflection as I took my seat at the far end of the glass table. I didn't look at Vivian. I knew what I would see in her eyes, the smug triumph of a woman who believed she had successfully used my grandmother's life as a bargaining chip. Edward cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed reading glasses as he slid a thick blue-bound document across the smooth glass. It stopped exactly 3 inches from my hands. "Clara, this is the final uncompensated transfer instrument for 100% of your preferred shares in the Vance Family Trust. By executing this document, you waive all current and future claims against Victoria Holdings LLC, its subsidiaries, and its officers. You are releasing these shares for 0 consideration, entirely of your own volition." "And the Swiss escrow account for my grandmother?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the blue binder. I let a faint, calculated tremor touch my voice. Vivian leaned forward, her pearls clicking against the glass edge of the table. She smiled, a thin, superficial parting of her lips that didn't reach her cold eyes. "The moment your signature is verified by the clearing auditors, Julian will enter the authorization code. The wire to the Montreux Clinic will clear within 5 minutes. We are people of our word, Clara. But business is business." "Sign it, Clara," Julian snapped, sliding his gold pelican pen across the table. It rolled with a soft, hollow sound, stopping right next to the binder. "Stop dragging this out. You know you don't have a choice." I looked around the room. I looked at the Blackstone executives, who were checking their Rolexes. I looked at the bank auditors, who were waiting to log the asset transfer. They thought they were witnessing the final act of a family tragedy. The weak, idealistic sister being squeezed out by the smarter, more aggressive heirs. I reached out my hand. My fingers were steady, but I forced them to hesitate for a fraction of a second before picking up the pen. I flipped the heavy bond paper to page 42. The signature line was marked with a small yellow sticky arrow. Clara Vance, transfer. I pressed the gold nib to the paper. The ink flowed in a smooth, dark line as I wrote my name. The scratch of the metal against the heavy paper was the only sound in the silent room. I blew on the ink for a second, then slid the binder back toward the center of the table. "It's done," I whispered. Before my hand had even fully retracted, Julian lunged forward. The sheer, unadulterated greed in his eyes was almost pathetic. He literally snatched the blue binder across the glass, terrified that I might change my mind or rip the page out. His chest heaved with a sharp, ragged breath of pure relief. "Edward, verify it," Julian commanded, his voice shaking slightly with excitement as he pulled his own pen from his vest pocket. He didn't even wait for the lawyer. He flipped to the transferee line and signed his own name with a savage, triumphant stroke. "Julian Vance, transferee." He slammed the binder shut and pushed it into Edward's chest. "Read the execution confirmation clause for the Blackstone team. Let's get the closing code logged." Vivian let out a soft, elegant laugh, leaning back into her leather chair. "Well done, Julian." Now Edward read it into the record. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens right before a car crash, where you can hear the individual drops of rain hitting the glass 45 floors above Manhattan. Edward opened the binder. He turned to page 42. He adjusted his glasses, his mouth opening to read the standard boilerplate language that usually concludes these corporate transactions. Then his entire body locked. The sophisticated, untouchable Manhattan lawyer didn't move a muscle. His breathing simply stopped. The color didn't just leave his face. It evaporated, leaving his skin a sickening mottled gray, like wet chalk. His jaw slackened, his lower lip trembling slightly as his eyes raced across the short, italicized paragraph directly beneath our signatures. The paragraph he had completely ignored yesterday because he thought it was just burial plot directives. A single thick drop of sweat broke from his receding hairline and rolled down the deep line of his forehead, pooling in the groove of his eyelid. He didn't wipe it away. His fingers, still holding the edge of the blue binder, began to shake so violently that the heavy bond paper rattled like dry leaves in a winter wind. "Edward!" Julian's voice sharpened, his brow furrowing in immediate irritation. "What the hell is the matter with you? Read the sentence. We are on a clock here." Edward didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat made a grotesque, dry clicking sound as he tried to swallow. He looked up at Julian, his eyes wide, terrified, staring at his client as if he were looking at a ghost. "Edward!" Vivian barked, her aristocratic composure finally cracking. "Read it now." The lawyer's hand shook so badly he almost dropped the binder. He looked down at the page again, his voice cracking like dry kindling when he finally forced the words out. He read the sentence that my father and I had buried in the Nassau County Registry 6 months ago. Asterisk pursuant to Section 42B of the Restated Trust Covenant, the voluntary execution of this non-compensated transfer instrument by the transferee constitutes an unconditional, irrevocable assumption of all retroactively audited federal tax liabilities under Internal Revenue Code Section 7201, instantly freezing all underlying common corporate assets into a non-discretionary federal escrow as collateral for the outstanding $42 million penalty. Asterisk Edward's voice died on the last word. He slowly took off his glasses, his hands trembling so much he couldn't fold the temples. He looked at Julian, his voice a hollow, terrified whisper. "Julian, you just signed a personal guarantee for the Cayman tax fraud." Julian stood up so fast his heavy leather chair screeched violently against the terrazzo floor. "What the hell do you mean, personal guarantee?" His voice climbed an octave, stripping away his polished Wharton veneer. exposing the raw, panicking animal underneath. The Cayman entity is an offshore LLC. It's a separate legal fiction. The corporate veil protects me. I didn't lean away from his fury. I leaned forward, my palms flat against the cool glass table. The corporate veil has one fatal flaw, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into an icy register of absolute certainty. It dissolves completely in the presence of criminal fraud. My father knew exactly how you and Vivian manipulated the international fuel ledgers to artificially inflate the EBITDA for Blackstone. He spent his final months documenting every single dollar of that $42 million tariff evasion. Julian turned on Edward, his face an ugly mottled purple. Edward, fix this. Tell her she is completely insane. Edward didn't look at his client. His hands trembled violently. She isn't insane, Julian, the lawyer whispered, his voice sounding like dry paper rubbing together. Section 42B of the Restated Trust Covenant is a cross-indemnification trigger. Under New York estate law, by signing this uncompensated assignment to consolidate corporate shares, you legally accepted the reciprocal obligations of all interconnected foreign subsidiaries. You didn't just take her preferred shares. You took the Cayman liabilities. You have legally declared that Vance Marine Logistics Cayman Limited is your alter ego. The financial math was brutal, cold, and final. Under Internal Revenue Code Section 7201, willful tax evasion triggers an automatic 100% civil fraud penalty plus compounded daily interest retroactive to 2021. The total liability sat at exactly $42 million. Julian had just personally, unconditionally assumed responsibility for every cent of it. Across the table, the lead Blackstone executive smoothly disconnected his tablet from the monitor and slid it into his briefcase. The sharp, metallic snap of the lock broke the silence like a pistol shot. This transaction is terminated, the executive said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Pursuant to Section 9 of our Memorandum of Understanding, any undisclosed federal tax investigation voids the acquisition. Good luck with the IRS, Julian. Wait. Julian lunged across the glass, his hands clawing at the executive's sleeve. We can restructure the deal. We can isolate the Cayman accounts. Get your hands off me, the Blackstone rep said with disgusted precision, walking out followed closely by his two associates. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them. The $400 million buyout vanished. The family legacy was dead. Julian spun around, eyes wild, clawing at the blue binder to rip page 42 out of the binding. He wanted to destroy the evidence to pretend the signature never happened. Don't do that, Mr. Vance, one of the independent BNY Mellon auditors said calmly, tapping her laptop screen. The entire signing ceremony is being recorded via our secure electronic escrow stream. Your digital signature hash was uploaded to the Nassau County Registry exactly 4 seconds ago. Destroying the physical copy won't save you. It only adds a federal charge of destruction of evidence. Julian froze, his hand still gripping the crumpled paper, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. Beside him, Vivian's aristocratic posture finally failed her. Her fingers lost their grip on her pristine alligator Chanel handbag. It fell, spilling gold lipsticks and prescription pill bottles across the terrazzo. Her face was completely drained of blood, a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at the glass walls, realized the immense wealth she spent decades plotting to steal had evaporated into a federal tax lien, and slid down her chair, collapsing onto the floor in a dead faint. Nobody moved to help her. Then came the heavy double click of the main conference room doors opening. 4 men in dark navy trench coats stepped inside, walking with the heavy, deliberate stride of federal authority. The leader was Christopher Miller. He didn't look at Julian or Vivian. He looked directly at me and gave a microscopic nod. Then he pulled a golden enamel badge from his chest pocket. IRS Criminal Investigation Division, Miller announced, his voice slicing through the cold room. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal tax evasion and perjury under Title 26, United States Code. Edward, the great family lawyer, didn't hesitate. He immediately raised his hands, backing away toward the side exit. I am recusing myself from this matter effective immediately. I am no longer counsel for Julian Vance. 2 armed agents moved around the glass table, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. They grabbed Julian by his arms, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Julian didn't fight them. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, tears of pure terror finally spilling over his pristine cheekbones. "Clara, please, the Swiss wire. Your grandmother," he blubbered. "My grandmother is already perfectly safe, Julian," I said, standing up smoothly and smoothing down the front of my crisp white pantsuit. "I transferred her to the NYU Langone private wing 2 hours ago using my own funds." I picked up my leather briefcase. Thanks to the IRS whistleblower program under Title 26 U.S.C. Section 7623(b), because I provided original digital forensics that led to the recovery of corporate tax fraud exceeding $2 million, I am legally entitled to exactly 30% of the collected proceeds. 30% of $42 million is $12,600,000. Clean, non-taxable federal bounty money, paid directly by the United States Treasury. I walked past my stepbrother as the agents dragged him toward the elevator. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt only the deep, clean satisfaction of an architectural equation perfectly solved. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on his screams, and went down to the street. Outside, the rain had stopped. The morning New York air smelled fresh, cold, and completely free. Julian thought he could use the law to crush me because he had the money to buy the lawyers. But he forgot the golden rule of the American system. The law doesn't belong to the highest bidder. It belongs to the person who understands the architecture of the trap. What do you think of my malicious compliance? Would you have had the icy patience to play the victim until the federal trap was completely locked? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button, and don't miss our next story of high IQ justice. Thank you for listening.